Happy to introduce Professor Vera Tolz from the University of Manchester, a prominent British academic, a historian, and also an expert on nationalism, ethnic politics, and identity discourses, media studies, and disinformation. Vera started her training in St. Petersburg State University in classics and got her PhD in Russian and East European studies from the University of Birmingham in 1993. Her research was notably shifting towards imperial and national issues in Russia and Eastern Europe well before it became fashionable as it is now. So many of our colleagues, and usually people younger than us, they think that this is a really fresh kind of wind and truly new trend of studying imperialism or colonialism or applying these concepts to East European history and politics, while Vera and I, we know very well how old this trend is. And indeed it has been continuing and developing hugely for very understandable political reasons. Among Vera Tolz's contributions are such books as Russia Inventing the Nation, 2001. My favorite one is Russia's Own Orient, 2011, analyzing Orientalism in late Imperial and early Soviet Russia. And a very recent book, quoted study called Russia, Disinformation and the Liberal Order. Is that right?
Yeah. The latest one, yeah.
There is leading several major research projects studying propaganda, Russian propaganda, and disinformation, misinformation on the Russian television and mass media. And that's, as far as I kind of know, probably the most consistent and accomplished research project on contemporary Russia in the British academia.
I mean, certainly on the Russian media, yeah, Steve Hutchings and I have been working longer than kind of, anyone else, certainly in Britain.
It is an elected fellow of the British Academy of Social Sciences. And she has held prestigious fellowships at Harvard, Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. And I really hope that this truly consistent and serious and thorough scholarship, combining major research projects, well-funded research projects, and creative, new, truly original approaches to scholarship. This combination will continue in the future. So we will be listening to an entirely new idea, new project, new initiative. And Vera told me that she is sincerely interested in our feedback and advice of how to advance it further. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction, Alexander. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also thank you to Ivan and Akos for organizing my trip so well. Now I understand that you all are part of the research hub studying the politics of Anthropocene, and I hope that actually my research will speak quite directly to your agenda, because as far as I understand, you see the Anthropocene as the era when natural disruptions actually take the form of socio-political phenomenon. And they are governed, these disruptions, in a particular way. They are discursively constructed in a particular way, and they are publicly narrated. And among those communication actors whom you also study in your project, clearly people who try to use public anxieties and fear and convert those fears and anxieties into political leverage. And that happens in relation to kind of any situation of crisis. And I will be talking about a historical case of health crisis around AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And indeed, the material, the case study I'll be presenting to you is entirely new. It's kind of material I myself collected, even though a massive amount of stuff has been written about AIDS, but nobody has looked at particular aspect I'll be highlighting. And so I'm indeed very interested in your kind of views as to how I'm trying to see the significance of this case study, and maybe you'll have further ideas. So I'll start by saying a few words about my terminology, about the particular analytical framework, which, with the help of a couple of colleagues, I know one of whom has joined us, Sofia Tipaldu from the University of Athens, have developed and published in communication theory. And then I'll present the case study and its implications. And implications for studying sort of problematic mass communications. My research represents a historical strand of a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, in which I co-lead with Professor Stephen Hutchings at the University of Manchester. And the project is called Mistranslating Deceit, Disinformation as a Translingual Discursive Dynamic. And I'll be using the word disinformation, even though I'm very well aware that the whole concept of disinformation and the terminology has been questioned and critiqued, including by us in our project. And the critique mostly sort of boils down to the arguments that, first of all, disinformation is an accusatory term, and so it is very loaded, and loaded terms usually do not work well as kind of analytical concepts. And the very fact that there is a kind of very persistent myth, which is repeated in academic literature, that the term was coined by the Soviets, and the fact that it's a myth, it's not a reality, it was coined by actually US journalists in the late 19th century, using by then well-established word misinformation and changing it a bit. So it already tells you that it's kind of a term of practice and the term of accusing the other. But also it's a very broad umbrella term which subsumes very different types of practices. So sometimes it obscures more than it reveals. But for, I think, my particular purpose in this presentation, it works quite well, this term, for two reasons. One is that two main actors I'll be looking at, one British, one American physicians, advanced on their own accord the notion that AIDS was manufactured, the virus causing AIDS was manufactured in a US or maybe Soviet military or medical research laboratory was advanced at the time when this kind of notion was completely rejected by mainstream experts on the disease. And also, simultaneously, there was also the time when the Soviet KGB and East German Stasi launched an organized campaign of deception, also to claim that AIDS was a product of a specifically US military laboratory. And of course, this communist security services operatives were not interested in scientific truth. That was an organized campaign of deception, and to me, sort of the word disinformation is appropriate to talk about this kind of mass communications. Now, our project started when there was kind of the whole field of research called disinformation study, and it was at its peak. And now, for various reasons, it's basically more or less collapsed, or is collapsed in the United States and subsiding elsewhere. But even kind of before the most recent trends, various scholars began to raise issues about the kind of dominant, by then dominant approaches to study, broadly speaking, informational disorder. And here is just a list of very few works. I could have kind of tripled and quadrupled this list. But I mentioned here some studies which are relevant and on which we also kind of build on in our work. And particularly, you probably, if you don't know, but most of you probably do know, Benkler and Alle's work, Network Propaganda, Manipulation, Disinformation, and Radicalization in American Politics. And it's a superb book, which looks specifically at right-wing networks within the American media, the US media, and show how they operate online. And also how they collaborate with various foreign actors, including Russian actors, for example. And their argument is that we should actually look at this kind of global nature of this network and pay particular attention at the feedback loops that they generate. I also found very useful Marwick's work, and she has published a whole range of articles, also arguing that actually when studying disinformation, we need to look at particular media practices which are widely spread, not on specific campaigns and, let's say, campaigns by foreign actors like Iran, China, or Russia, or indeed domestic US actors who also organized campaigns, as Benkler showed. So with my colleagues on the Mistranslating Deceit project, we came up with a concept of the disinformation life cycle. And kind of when developing this concept, we proceeded from the premise that the way we imagine a phenomena to start with influences how we understand the material, what we see, what we don't see, what blind spots we create, what we focus on, and basically very much influence one preconceived kind of perceptions of the phenomenon, influence the result. And what we sort of proposed is something which contrasts to largely understanding of disinformation as a particular content, a particular problematic content. And instead we suggested that we should look at it as a self-transforming, self-renewing, multi-actor process, which can only be understood not in isolation from broader mass media communications, many of which are, let's say, mainstream ones which we don't regard as problematic, and also from interaction of this disinformation with its real audiences or audiences perceived by the producers of problematic content. And that's something that even Benkler and Faris and Roberts don't do. So again, they look at these networks of extreme right-wing conspiracy theorists in the United States as if they're kind of in a vacuum. So we wanted to see how problematic narratives travel through time, space, media environments, discursive environments. So what happens to them, linguocultural environments, when they cross boundaries. Again, we have an article, you can look at detailed discussion of our analytical model in the journal Communication Theory. It's from 2025. And we use a current example, a recent example of COVID disinformation, mostly focusing on Russian disinformation in this article. What is particularly, I think, novel in this model is that when accounting for how actors who are accused of disinformation, and there you will understand why we included, I won't go into the explanation of how we identified disinformation content in relation to COVID, you can find the details in the article. So what we noticed that the actors who produce the content, which for particular reasons we identified as disinformation, interacted with, again, other forms of information providers, including scientific, mainstream, journalistic, public, but also their audiences, not only social media users, but also what we noticed, and that was kind of novel in terms of integrating into analytical model, it was clear that these actors we looked at saw Western counter-disinformation monitors as their audiences and produced their output with that audience in mind, not only kind of rebutting their accusations, but sometimes preempting their accusations. And another thing which we noticed, and in particular we were looking at one disinformation database, which has its strength but also very significant weaknesses. It was produced by East.com, called EU versus Disinfo, that this engagement of disinformation, Russian disinformation actors with the compilers of EU versus Disinfo database would sometimes renew the cycle of disinformation. That was an interesting phenomenon. In order to analyze our material, we produced a kind of 5-step analytical model analyzing each communication we put in our data set in terms of how the authors, the producers authenticated their claims, and there were clear kind of practices which were not specific to them. That's practices of poor journalism, and we will see examples in my case study of that. Then how the particular claims changed with time, how they changed depending on the linguocultural content, the linguocultural aspects of the target audiences, then collusion of different actors across authoritarian states and democracies, and also how the audiences co-created disinformation. and audiences like social media users, and finally these interactions with counter-disinformation agencies in the West. And the renewal of the cycle was again an interesting example we identified. Most of the literature on current literature on disinformation, and again, some of the critique of disinformation studies have already emerged, making the same point I'll be making now, overstates, in my view, the novelty of the phenomenon because of the digital media. And a lot of the practices, as well as attempt to address the problems we actually find historically, and that's what my current research is about. I'll now discuss, with the application of this disinformation lifecycle model, a case study, historical case study from our project, and it's a very well-known kind of, in a way, story, disinformation that AIDS virus was produced in a laboratory. One of the actors who was very important in articulating this particular claim, false claim, was Yakov Segal, a person with complex biography and actually Holocaust, who probably believed in this story, but he was also willing or wittingly or unwittingly, he clearly was absolutely central for the KGB/Stasi disinformation campaign. And he's very well known in this capacity. A lot is written about him. But two other actors, Robert Strecker, pathologist, physician from California, and John Seal, a specialist on venereal diseases from London. Their role is actually very little accounted for in existing literature, yet, as we will see, their impact, potential impact on Anglophone Western democracies was very significant and multiple times greater than the Soviets could have in accessing those audiences. And here again, we see parallels with some of the current dynamics. Huge interest in, let's say, Russian disinformation campaigns, which would present a major issue for countries neighboring Russia, but very little issue for, in fact, the United Kingdom. Probably not much of an issue for Austria, but a huge interest on the part of the government, various counter-disinformation agencies, which, for instance, British government funds, but far less attention being paid to intra-democratic local disinformation providers around the same issues. So on AIDS disinformation campaign, there's a lot of research. On the Soviet bloc disinformation campaign, which ran between 1985 and probably until 1989, but in 1987, we know from George Shultz's memoirs. George Shultz was US Secretary of State at the time, that he asked Gorbachev in 1987 to interfere and to stop the campaign. And indeed, that happened, but there is now evidence that on their own accord, Stasi continued the sort of disinformation with the help of Bulgarian Secret Service until 1989. We have extensive literature on the Soviet campaign. I just a few but main titles here. publications of differing quality, of which the best is, I think, Geisler and Sprinkler, the article of 2013. It is incredibly well researched, given the information they had access to at the time, including they did extensive work in Stasi archive. And again, identifying, interestingly, they think that Segal did believe, the East German sort of actor, did believe in the lab conspiracy genuinely, and was just used by Stasi, but it is sort of beside the point for us. And Thomas Reed, I don't know whether you're familiar, it's a brilliant book by Thomas Reed called Active Measures. But for Reed, the Soviet disinformation campaign is sort of one of multiple cases he discusses. But again, what is important for us in his story is that he actually notes rightly that the Soviets did not invent the laboratory claim, that the claim was articulated in niche gay community newspapers in the United States and picked up probably by the Soviets from that source, which fits with generally how disinformation campaigns worked, organized by security services. They don't invent themselves stories. They pick it up from somewhere because they need a story which already has some traction, which they then hope to amplify. In most cases, not always, but in most cases. And that will be relevant for our story. Then there is literature on AIDS disinformation in Africa, where actually Soviet disinformation campaign did have an impact, but that won't be part of our story. And then there are a few works on AIDS disinformation in North America, which claim that it basically was the issue affecting small communities of usually ethnic minorities or gay communities. And that, we'll see, was not the case. We'll come to this later. Now, my sources for this case study come from an absolutely amazing database called newspapers.com, which, of course, it's not comprehensive. None of these databases are comprehensive. But it is a very, very rich database of digitized copies of Anglophone newspapers going back to the 17th century up to the 21st century. So it's an absolutely massive database. And when you have access to this kind of information, then a very different picture of how disinformation traveled in the past emerges. And actually, then we have very common claim now that in the past we had democratic states had shared realities, and now we don't have a shared reality. In democratic societies, we have such a polarization and such a kind of plurality of media sources, news sources, and so much of it is sort of terrible fake news and disinformation. So we no longer have shared reality, which is essential for democracy. In the past we had. If you look at local newspapers, of which, of course, both in Britain and the United States, there were hundreds, and in the United States, hundreds of thousands, and that was what most people read. And if you look at a lot of these newspapers and then compare to New York Times, Washington Post, you think, yeah, no, people had very different realities. And clearly, in terms of the local press, in these two largest Anglophone democracies, USA and UK, you have no quality control of the local press. It's absolutely horrific. And a lot of people were exposed to it. So I used various searches of this database to create my own data sets. It was incredibly time-consuming enterprise because a lot of counting I had to do manually and kind of basically check whether the samples, whether everything in the sample which were created through the engines of the database was actually relevant. And so I was very conservative in my counting, hopefully accurate, but then you'll see that we have viral spreads actually through this the press with very little quality control of very dubious claims. So then I applied to the selected material this 5-step analytical model I've described, and through this data sets you start seeing various networks and the relationships between different actors and different claims, which is very interesting. And also I still need to conduct because I have various questions, so hopefully I'll get more information around that from working in future with the archive of one of my main protagonists, this UK doctor, John Seal, and his personal papers and his correspondence with my main US protagonist, Robert Strecker, it's available in the Wellcome Trust archive in London. So I think that my case study, raises the question of the influence of domestic versus foreign disinformation actors within established democracies. Again, there could be different dynamics in other states. Again, the need to account for variation in the media quality control within democratic systems. And again, we now have emerging literature, actually in relation to the 1930s, that a lot of claims which were made in relation, for instance, to the engagement of American newspapers with Nazi propaganda were historically based on looking at the national press, at the quality newspapers, not at these local newspapers. And then if you start looking at the local newspapers, again, with the help of these databases, because otherwise you can't really assemble so many of different newspapers, you'll start seeing a very different, much more alarming picture. And then the structural similarity between disinformation dynamics in pre-digital and digital context. And finally, again, how analytical distortions are produced by selective focus on kind of one particular actor without looking at a broader picture. So now the quick summary of my findings. Probably some of you know already the details of the Soviet AIDS disinformation campaign, the claim that the virus was created in the US military laboratory, the Fort Detrick. It first actually appeared in 1983, when the Soviets planted an article in the newspaper called Patriot. It's actually a newspaper produced in India, but published in English. And this publication had absolutely no uptake anywhere. And then and that was just an attempt. I think it was a kind of fishing exercise. But the full-scale disinformation campaign started in earnest with a publication in Literaturная Gazeta on the 30th of October of 1985, and then there was follow-up article in December of the same year. Just a small note here, personal note. At that time, I worked in Radio Liberty Research Department, and it is my colleague, Yulia Vishnevskaya, who worked there, who noticed the Literaturная Gazeta article, and that's why by December of 1985, the US State Department and all the US embassies around the world knew about this campaign. So it was all in front of my eyes. I remember she coming to my office and saying, look, this is significant. And indeed it was. However, a British doctor, John Seale, seemingly independently generated and aggressively start promoting approximately in the same time multiple conspiracies around AIDS, including the laboratory-based claim. Now, again, here I'm relying on Geisler and Sprinkler's article and sort of all the others, also a guy called Bogart. There is absolutely no evidence that Seale had anything to do with the KGB and the Soviet campaign. Maybe if I work in his archive, I find something else. But at this moment, it seems that he was a completely independent actor. And he had absolutely no expertise to do research. He was just a practicing doctor in London. He had no expertise to do scientific research on AIDS. But clearly he was a conspiracy theorist, and as some of such figures are, he was absolutely obsessed with the idea, and he had an absolutely fantastic amount of energy trying to publicize his views. He was also staunchly anti-communist. He already, by December 1985, he already had a press profile because local, poor quality, controlled British, but also American, North American, including Canadian local newspapers published his alarmist claims that the humankind will be extinct in 50 years from AIDS. He seemed to have been influenced. So again, you can ask me how I know certain things, and they come from my reading of dozens and dozens and dozens of articles by this Seale. He seemed to have got the idea about the lab origins of AIDS from again, gay newspapers in the United States, so the same origin as the Soviet, and also a book which had a lot of publicity about US bioweapon program by two very reputable British journalists, one of whom I'm sure Alexander, probably Anton also, who have lived in the UK, have heard Jeremy Paxman. Paxman was saying nothing about AIDS, but it's 1982 book, but it seems to have influenced Seale's ideas. And so in December, actually on 20th December, Seale had a breakthrough. His claim that AIDS was produced in a US laboratory was picked up by United Press International, which at the time was one of the four main international news agencies. So it's was then a very major American news agency. And he picked up this nonsense just for sensationalism reason. The UPI journalist went to the American embassy, and he presented Seal's revelation as if Seal produced a report, a scientific report, on the request of New Zealand Foundation for Research on AIDS. In fact, New Zealand Foundation Research of AIDS most likely have not requested anything from Seal, but Seal produced this report. He constantly produced reports and sent them everywhere. He probably sent it to this New Zealand place. So the journalists from UPI went to the American embassy, asked them about the claim. By then, they already knew about Literaturная Gazeta article, and so they said it's pure example of Soviet disinformation. Then the UPI journalist came to Seal and said, look, the Americans are saying it's Soviet disinformation. And to that, Seal, we'll find it all in UPI article, responds, the Soviets are saying, I just thought it is created in a laboratory. It's a speculation that it's US laboratory. They call them Russians, so the Russians accuse Americans of disinformation. That's a great circumstantial evidence that the virus was created in a Russian laboratory. And UPI journalist publishes this article. The article is absolutely, it's structured exactly in the same way as all these examples of Russian disinformation around COVID we find in EU versus Disinfo database. Sensational title, massive exaggeration of the credentials of a very dubious person who is not an expert in the field but presented as an expert. There is a little refutation in the middle, buried in the middle of the article, that some specialists disagree with this claim. And it ends with American refutation of the Soviet propaganda, and then Seal saying, yes, that means that it's actually Russians who created it in the laboratory. Now, according to what I could find in newspapers.com database, which, mind you, does not have all the examples because there are some other publications I know from other sources which are not there. So it's probably more, but there were 85 newspapers which republished this UPI report. Some making it even worse by taking any refutation out. So presenting it as a fact that, the either Russian or American laboratory created AIDS. And what is interesting, it's not only the local press, local newspapers with no kind of quality control. There is Daily Mirror. This is a British tabloid. It's one of the main British tabloids. These newspapers also have no quality control and just publish sensational nonsense. At the time, its paid subscription is 3.5 million. So, it's a very big audience, which is kind of comparable to the audiences of viral online posts. And this one doesn't even have any refutation of the lab origin claim. What is, to me, was very surprising that Los Angeles Times, which was a quality newspaper, but even that republished this nonsense claim by Seal with a very little kind of caveat that it might not be true, but on the whole, it basically gives him free rein. And the only newspaper of the major ones, which kind of the article itself is a good one. So look, UPI had this report, but the report is nonsense. It's The Guardian. It's, again, left-wing British broadsheet. But look at the title. Even the title, because they want kind of attention, they want to sensationalize. The title is very problematic. Yeah? And so then you have sort of other examples of the life of this article by Seal elsewhere. And then, again, you have cross-border interaction with other disinformation providers. Russian Radio Moscow World Service, also within a couple of days, picks up and publicizes Seal's claim. Now, 1986 is the period when Yakov Segal comes on scene. He produces a pamphlet claiming the US laboratory origin, claiming that the current explanations that it's originated in monkeys in Africa, mainstream explanation is racist. And the pamphlet the KGB distributes in Africa and Stasi distribute in Africa, and it has resonance there. And for, again, race frame helps it resonate. And then in October 1986, and Sunday Express, it's another British tabloid with 2.5 million circulation, publishes an article where Seal is interviewed, Robert Streck is interviewed, and Segal is interviewed. And Segal is mentioned by name. And because Segal appears there, the article attracts attention. And if you now, let's say, you use Google AI with a query about assertions in the Sunday Express article, will read that it claimed the disease was manufactured in a laboratory based on allegations by Dr. Yakov Segal, an agent of the Soviet bloc Operation Denver. But in fact, in this article, if you read this article, Segal is a secondary figure. The main actor is Seal. And Seal clearly is entirely responsible for the publication of this article. Also, Thomas Reed, in his book, gives links to, in the 1990s, probably disseminated Soviet KGB documents where the KGB agents celebrate the publication of Sunday Express articles. Say it's happened without us, but it gives huge publicity to our campaign. So the KGB admits they have nothing to do with the article. And indeed, it's orchestrated by Seal, who already in '86 also several local newspapers published his lab theory. And on the 1st of October 1986, we have an article by a pensioner from Devon, where Seal had his holiday home, saying that she read Seal's earlier assertions, found his theory alarming and convincing, and she helped him to lobby the Fleet Street, and Fleet Street is the street where headquarters of national British newspapers, including Sunday Express, is located. So they sent together multiple letters to the national press in the UK to publish Seal's article. And this pensioner says, and it paid off. Sunday Express published this important revelation. We know from Geisler and Sprinker that Segal, earlier in 1986, wrote to Seal. And Seal probably then and he already, Seal was in correspondence with Strecker. So he brings Strecker in, he brings Segal in. Altogether, 44 relevant articles I found in the database featuring Seal's allegations. They refer to Sunday Express, all these publications, and they talk about Seal. So Segal is completely secondary. They mostly don't even mention him by name. So in the Western Anglophone press, Segal it's not his claim. The claim is Seal's. And what is interesting, again, very similar to what we have now with the users of social media who add their more fantastic theories to particular new media communications with disinformation. Here we find readers' letters. Say, I've heard of Strecker, I've heard of Segal. This is a fantastic theory. I think this is actually the AIDS was manufactured by these culprits and that culprits. Okay, so let's move on because otherwise we won't have time for questions. In 1987, very quickly, another interesting development. The Reagan's administration becomes completely fed up after Associated Press picks up Radio Moscow claim and CBS Evening News with massive audience, 10 million, puts out a report. The report is actually not bad. They say that they mention the Soviet claim, but largely the report is critical and says there is no evidence. The mainstream experts refute it. But still, the White House became very upset about this particular kind of infiltration of the Soviet disinformation into American media sphere. Catherine Bailey of the US State Department writes an article, it's a very well-informed article, in Los Angeles Times, revealing the details of the Soviet disinformation campaign. And the same day, dozens of US newspapers reprint her article. What we find, again, from my data set, very similar to the dynamics we can see today, that sometimes counter-disinformation efforts amplify disinformation. And so somehow Seal, who is mentioned, again, she prioritizes Segal, but nobody knows Segal in the United States, but they know Seal already. So it attracts another way of attention to him. And again, there are actually so many articles I haven't even been able properly to count. So in the database at this stage relating to Seal. So I'm not giving you a figure. But USA Today publishes an appalling piece in terms of quality of journalism, basically publicizing Seal's theory. Boston Globe, I'm surprised because it's a very reputable newspaper, another very poor article. And some of these publications specifically say this is not a bit example of Soviet disinformation. A reputable, a leading British expert says this. Yeah, so we have this. In 1988, Seal starts developing extremely homophobic narrative, and so he then attracts attention even of legislators in the very conservative states and is invited to speak and again publicize his theory. And importantly, in 1988, this another doctor, Robert Strecker, very similar kind of conspiracy theorist, fanatically active, produces a video with his own allegations and his theory, because he is very anti-Soviet. So his theory is that East European communists managed to infiltrate the World Health Organization and the Institute for Health Research in Washington, and they created AIDS in their laboratory there. And by 1989, in my sample, Strecker and Seal kind of change places. So Seal becomes secondary and Strecker becomes first. And we have 382 articles in different newspapers featuring Strecker's memorandum with his AIDS lab theory. And then he also manages to get on the very popular show, Tony Brown's journal, which was a PBS flagship program. And so you can see even the questions of the program. Is AIDS a biological war experiment? Is it an ethnic weapon against African Americans? There was another question. Did these experts try to play God and conjured the devil? So that is the framing. So there is a whole life, further life of both Strecker and Seal, but also Segal after the collapse of communism in the 1990s and 2000, because Seal actually was almost 100 when he died in 2020, and he was at it, but it's not part of this story. So very quickly, we can see all the sections of all the steps of our model with authentication of truth claims with very similar methods in the past and today. There is temporal fluctuation from US lab to Soviet lab, and then there was another twist. Again, I won't bore you with details of Seal's conspiracy theory, linguocultural, geopolitical shifts and boundary crossing, trans-border collaborations and audience remediations. Interesting how many readers' letters are in the samples which newspapers publish, which also kind of embellish theories, but also disinformation, counter-disinformation dynamics. I gave you one example, but there are more of those. So what are the broader kind of issues here? So if we actually look at the press, particularly local and press, and also smaller regional newspapers, at least across the Anglophone world, because I have also examples from Australia, for instance, we will see that actually the pre-digital media, because of the multiplicity of this local level, bottom level press, and the fact that they take from each other within a couple of days, this sensational news, we can see very similar sort of viral spreads with speed, scale, and renewal. Audiences, again, very often contemporary literature said that now the disinformation content is, or informational content, not just meanings, but content, are co-produced by users. But again, we can look at readers' letters in the same way. And in fact, Walter Lippmann, the kind of founding father of political communication research in the 1920s, already sort of draws attention to readers' letters as creators of information. Domestic versus foreign influence sometimes, because if we look just at foreign influence campaign, we don't see this broader picture of domestic intra-democratic actors who are actually much more impactful. And then we have pre-digital, digital structural similarities, so the vast variety of media quality control. Again, syndicated chains, because Tony Brown's journal had such a wide audience, 5 million, and it was massively publicized, his show, in the American press. Literally, we have over 300 articles publicizing Strecker's claim. And it's because it's syndicated show. It's syndicated in 85 cities of the United States. So in all these 85 cities and the regions, the show is massively advertised. And then you have poor quality, basically local journalistic standards. So I'll stop at that, and we will welcome your comments and your advice as to how to take it further.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And please, yeah.
Thank you so much for this fascinating case study. I feel first I want to give a comment and then also a question. For the comment, what you described at this last page, this domestic versus foreign influence, this is a good example where you could actually analyze both, which you cannot do with the EU versus disinfo.
Yeah.
This is an organization run by the European Commission, and if they start talking about domestic intra-democratic influences, they will be accused of interfering in the domestic.
Of course,
so actually, this is even in the past. I think it was more objective than it is today. So this is one of those limitations that you're aware of. A question concerns the use of the term disinformation. If we take the traditional interpretation of disinformation as false information that is spread or created with a malign intent, I'm not sure that Jakob Sigel is, you mentioned yourself, he actually believed in what he wrote, in what he spread. So he did not have a malign intent when he spread that false information. And also, disinformation maybe it could have been created with a malign intent by, say, the KGB or the Stasi, but at some point it could actually turn into misinformation where there is no malign intent to spread this. So how do you deal with with these trajectories?
Now, there are, of course, first of all, yes, you're absolutely right about the kind of limitations of EU versus disinfo, and probably the key reason for it, you rightly identify, I absolutely agree. But the thing is that, interestingly, that basically the literature on kind of Soviet campaign, it also brackets out, ultimately, everything which does not specifically belong to that particular campaign, and it exaggerates its effects, and it doesn't account for the fact there were other actors who had much greater effect. So just the focus on one thing and looking at it as if it's in a vacuum creates blind spots and ultimately very skewed picture. Let's say Sunday Express article features very prominently, but it features in relation to the Seagal, who is completely secondary there. And we have even AI trained to respond with reference to Seagal in relation to this publication, which is absolutely central to any analysis of the campaign. And on the whole, I think there is, as you know, probably better than me, because you've been studying probably specifically disinformation longer than I have, but I've studied other kind of forms of, let's say, propaganda. there is a tendency, for whatever reason, to look at kind of foreign campaigns and externalize disinformation as a problem, kind of problem external to democratic states, and then perception of problematic content as something which is injected from outside democracy into otherwise pristine democratic media environment. That's how you, FEMI, yeah, exactly. So it's how you imagine the phenomenon, so wrongly from the start, and then you have basically very misleading picture. Now, in terms of the difference between disinformation and misinformation, I think, again, I agree with those kind of scholars who have written that it's very difficult actually to pinpoint intent. Again, with Segal, we don't know for sure, we are sort of speculating, and it's almost no point to sort of try to ascertain intent because we are guessing. And interestingly, in the United States, there is a much greater tendency to use the word misinformation for everything. So disinformation and misinformation is kind of two separate. It's much more embedded in European lexicons, UK lexicon, but not in the United States. And that is actually historical in the United States, that there are sort of the word misinformation or disinformation is used interchangeably. So to me, it actually doesn't really matter whether I think that Seal believed all these different sort of versions, narratives he was, but I don't know. And in a way, it's beside the point. The point is that it is a clearly very problematic claim. The mainstream expertise, but in 1986, East German scientists are saying it's nonsense. Lab theory is nonsense, and actually are appealing to the Communist Party, to Rainy and Stasi, saying that, look, you are undermining our academic reputation. In the Soviet Union, you already have, in 1986, some liberalization under Gorbachev. So the main specialist on AIDS, Viktor Zhdanov, in Paris, at the conference in Paris, says the lab theory is nonsense, while the KGB is pushing this line. But
Putin was there.
Sorry?
Putin
was there, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But he was in East Germany. Actually, Western newspapers, including this Catherine Bailey in Los Angeles Times, she is U.S. State Department representative, she quotes this Zhdanov, the Soviet expert, as one of those leading world experts who dismiss the theory. So, and Seal has no qualification to judge, clearly, yet the media, for various reasons, publicize his claims. And it publicized his claims for the reasons of basically how the media logic of how it works. Exactly. But clickbait, we think it's new. That is the same thing. It's clickbait. Yeah, sensationalism. So for me, it's not kind of an issue, really, the intent.
Okay. Thank you for a nice presentation. And to be honest with you, it's, for me, an eye-opener to be able to think more on the issue of disinformation. For my question, I just want us to go a little bit beyond the concept of theory from Segal and Seal. I'm just looking at it in a broader way, that at what level can we now say a kind of theory or information is disinformation, or we can say this is reliable? Because sometimes you see when certain theory or belief got into the hands of politicians, for example, they will blow it in order to win the election. And the whole country and the whole world sometimes we believe this theory. And the theory will stay for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And now, later on, we discover that this is not true.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's a little bit confusing because when you are saying this is disinformation, to some group of people, they will still see it as vital information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's, again, something we kind of discuss at the theoretical level, the philosophical level within our project. And particularly when we use concepts like disinformation narrative, where the kind of factual issues might be correct, but they are presented in such a way that those who say it's disinformation kind of object to, then we are in very, very kind of slippery territory. And that's exactly, but again, from my point of view here, again, at the time, the whole theory and its society was already refuted. By now, we don't have any new research which would have shown, or any evidence which would have shown there is anything behind this theory. So it's sort of, for this particular case, as I said at the beginning, I use this term disinformation. It's a very problematic term for the reasons you have outlined. It's one of the reasons for why the term is problematic. But for me, it applies here because the experts say this theory is unfounded. We have individuals, including Segal, who actually have no expertise. At least Segal is a scientist, but in a very different area. But Seal and Streck are not scientists. And Streck is not even related remotely. He's a pathologist, yeah? But their communication, refuted then, refuted now, is advertised. Plus, you have a campaign organized by a security service. And again, here, it's interesting for me what you think. I think that if a security service is organizing a clandestine campaign, in this campaign, quite a lot of information which they disseminate is actually factually correct. That has to be the case. And it's very interesting how Thomas Reed discusses it and shows internal discussions within the CIA, and he compares CIA campaigns and KGB campaigns over the whole 20th century and 21st century, how internal actors even say, in order for the campaign to work, 80% at least has to be factually correct. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And then you have 20%, which is sort of manipulated. And your core claim, which relates, is false. And most things around are correct. But because the origin is concealed, because even if it's an okay publication, but it's planted by security services, and it pretends to be not planted by security services, it's already deception. But with disinformation, again, that is a question. Where is deception? Is it in factual content? Is it in the origin of the claim? Is it in a way it's disseminated? Is it particular intent? It's a kind of difficult philosophical questions.
If I may, I would say it is intent that makes this information used. There is also a term, malinformation, which means it's a correct information. So if disinformation or misinformation is a false information, so malinformation is a correct information which is spread with the malign intent. For example, doxing is a good doxing. For example, you have your enemy online and you're publishing their home address. It's a correct information, his or her, but you're doing this with a malign intent to hurt a person.
Yeah,
I
but
think this intent is very important when
yeah, but
and what you said, for example, about or the concealed origins. This is what sometimes called black propaganda. There is a distinction between white, gray, and black. And well, this is black propaganda specifically because there is intent to conceal this and to mislead.
Yes, but okay. First of all, sometimes it's very, very difficult to prove. Let's say clearly the kind of Reagan administration, and also there was a very interesting example I had to skip of a British journalist writing about Seagal. They clearly believe that he has malign intent. Well, you started, Antonio, your comment by saying, I don't think Seagal had a malign intent. And we don't know, but ultimately, what, in a way, worries us more, I think there is a lot of anxiety now and among politicians and the public, and politicians try to take particular actions, that people consume clearly false claims. And then why does it matter? And this, to me, indeed, is the crux of the problem. It's not that, okay, if KGB with malign intent organizes, or somebody else organizes a campaign, it has no uptake. That's not such a serious issue. But if somebody with a good intent spreads actually very harmful information, they don't think it's harmful, but it is actually very harmful for the public, and it has a massive impact, surely it's much greater public issue.
Also on hybrid.
Yeah.
Jana.
I have a question about the role of the scientific community in there, because you were mentioning that neither Seagal or Strecker or Seal had really the proper scientific credits to actually address this question, but still they did. And so for the public, how would you know that a doctor is not the proper doctor for a specific? And the same happened with COVID. There was a lot of confusion also because of scientists, I'm doing this, but no, scientists, not even, who were just talking about something that was not in their field. And even I imagine that in the case of COVID, most of them might have been driven by moral or whatever, their own ethical vision of the world. And so maybe they were doing it in good faith anyway, but they knew that they were not doing it following the proper scientific protocol or whatever to actually have an opinion. So the scientific community having an opinion doesn't have the same impact as anyone else having an opinion, since they can wrap it into the clothes of scientific legitimacy and expertise. So I don't know how that plays in this debate between misinformation, disinformation.
So you're absolutely right. The public, say, but even sort of a newspaper editor probably doesn't quite understand that somebody who comes to them and says they are a doctor, they have researched a particular issue, and that's what I've found. They are not in a position to actually assess. And so sometimes you have a kind of a real expert who is a researcher working specifically, a scientist specifically working on AIDS virus. They say that, look, the Strecker isn't kind of part of our community. But then, again, a journalist also is not really in a position to judge. They come to Strecker or Seal and they say, it's any scientific dissent is always presented as disinformation. You know, these scientists, they have their own cliques and they try to kind of exclude particular kind of opinions. That's already a sensation. That creates another sort of misleading publication. Also, you say that people, indeed, rightly you say that people assess the claims on the basis of kind of preconceived moral positions. Seal is a terrible homophobe. And that gave him sailing in the newspapers, particularly in the United States, which are very, where the editor or journalist would be very homophobic. And there, Seal would say, yes, of course, they reject my theories. I constantly send to journals, they all reject it, because the whole establishment, medical, political, journalistic, is hijacked by homosexuals. And then it gives a further rise of publication.
By homosexuals.
Homosexuals, yeah. So that's
but he was also anti-communist.
He was also anti-communist. That's why once he heard that the Soviets were accusing Americans, saying, ah, yes, that means they themselves, that's circumstantial evidence that they themselves created. And then he's also supported by Geras Medvedev, the Soviet dissident in London. So they are very interesting sort of networks. But yes, it is for the public, for journalistic community, very difficult indeed to judge. But that is clearly very much used by sort of my actors.
Ivan.
Thank you, Vera. This is really fascinating, and I'm glad you brought up homosexuality to the topic, because you asked for potential suggestions for further avenues of research. I'm wondering if you came across or maybe read how this narrative about AIDS, which we, let's not forget, they were not probably only used to emphasize hostility and exclusion in the Cold War context, bloc division, but they were also called gay cancer.
Yeah,
AIDS
called
gay cancer. And how does this maybe, how these discourses, are they still maybe, for instance, present in the current so-called anti-gender movement, which is becoming so potent, where actually the two former blocs or their protagonists unite. We have an interesting ideological coalition of evangelicals from US close to Trump with far-right figures from Russia and churches, denominations coming together to protect children from becoming gays or whatever. And bringing this narrative, even though we know now that one can live perfectly fine with HIV, even if it's detected on time, you can not even pass it. It's undetectable, basically. So how these narratives, do you see it coming back, possibly, in heated debates?
What, sort of gender and sexuality, and that has been one of the kind of emotional triggers, as well as kind of central pieces to all sorts of disinformation campaigns. Interestingly, as far as, again, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the Soviet kind of publications do not raise much the gay issue. That at the time, in the 80s, maybe because it's basically they're not writing about sexuality at all in the newspapers. That's sort of the reason. It's still the time. I don't remember when the article, sometime against under Gorbachev, but late in Perestroika period, I think that the article criminalized gay sex was taken out of Soviet criminal courts. So it's during the campaign, peak of the campaign, it's still a criminal offense in the Soviet Union, but it's not discussed in the press. So that's why. Yeah. So that's why the Soviet communications sort of kind of avoid this issue. But you can see how for right-wing newspapers in the UK, in Britain, and elsewhere in the Anglophone world, the gay issue, that is gay culture, this is really absolutely kind of salient issue, and how the fact that Seal is clearly obsessed with homosexuality separately, it's another of his obsession. It helps him to establish networks with particular right-wing newspapers, and also he is invited, there was sort of coverage of that in the My Sample, to basically legislatures in the conservative states, and also again some conservative politicians even in democratic states like in New York invite him to speak at their gatherings, and there he of course brings in his lab theory, and then he added another theory, so maybe even if it's naturally evolved AIDS, still it so much spread in the United States because the Soviets injected American citizens with AIDS virus with a view of annihilating the population of the free world. So which is again an interesting example. He gets a pushback, yeah, because sometimes he's asked, but you know, the majority of scientists are saying that it's a naturally evolving virus. Oh yes, and then there is this explanation.
Henry.
Thank you so much. This was truly fascinating, the fact that the Soviet Union already seeded a theory which was taken up by American right-wing cranks in the 80s. And
But it didn't seed, that's the issue. It didn't. The theory was already in the United States, in the gay community. Then
so there was no this operation Denver. It was not there. It did not exist.
No, it did exist.
It did exist.
Of course.
That's organized by the KGB.
Yeah, of course.
In that sense, I would rephrase that it...
Yeah, of course. But they took this narrative from the gay press in the United States, and then made it up. Oh yeah, it was a huge operation. Not only it existed, but the Soviets claimed that's their most successful operation of all times.
Oh.
And that's interesting, and that's very often the articles written in the 21st century about this Operation Denver, sometimes called Operation Infection. That's how the Stasi called it. But it's joint. Also, Bulgarians were involved. It's existed.
So your point is that
they didn't invent the claim. They didn't invent the claim.
People invented this.
Yeah.
Etc.
The point is that the claim probably was invented in the gay community in the United States. The lab claim. Then the Soviets took it and started amplifying, organized disinformation campaign around it. Seal seems to have picked the claim. Maybe he came, we'll see, I will work with his papers. Maybe it's his own bright idea, but he might have, because he was obsessed with homosexuals, so he might have read the US gay press. But also he might have been kind of inspired by his reading of Jeremy Paxman's 1982 book about indeed dubious research in bioweapons in the United States, which went on in this Fort Detrick between 1940s and 1960s.
That was ethnic weapons, something like that.
It was biology. Soviets did it. The Americans did it.
Specific action.
Then they did discuss ethnic. Maybe it could be kind of ethnically targeted. Indeed, there was, and so SEAL is kind of another source.
I think we interrupted you.
Yes,
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. A very useful clarification. So by amplifying this theory, which was taken up by American cranks, it seems amazing that Russia under Putin has kind of let's say prolonged that mode of operation, because a lot of right-wing crank theories in the United States nowadays also have some connection with, let's say, Russian started campaigns. What is fascinating for me is that there seems to be almost no material benefit ever from that. The right wing seems to be, completely locked down. As you pointed out, it ended up being an anti-Soviet campaign. Seal said and this seems to be the same thing nowadays. That if you try to kind of court the right wing, either in Western Europe or North America, it never creates any material benefits for Russia or any PR benefits. So I'm wondering, what's behind this indefatigable wish to get the right wing on board, because it seems useless.
Yeah. First, it's what I found also very interesting is these parallels. It's so similar, the current and historical cases. It's not surprising that the current Russian government executes quite similar campaigns. I mean, the Russian government is run by the guys who were working back then. I mean, Putin probably was he was a low-level agent, but his unit in Leipzig was probably aware of.
He was
certainly
he
aware
didn't
of.
invent that, but he was learning from this story.
Yeah, exactly. So, but he was probably even some kind of maybe even personally involved, or certainly knew about, because Stasi was an absolutely key actor there. So, the current Russian government uses very, very similar techniques. Yes, they in the past, they say there was the most successful campaign, big impactful campaign. But actually, this Geisler Sprinkler, they rightly argued that it's what they call disinformation squared, because they say the Soviets exaggerate massively their impact, and then the Westerners writing about the Soviet campaign also exaggerate. So together they create this image of a very successful campaign. But with in a campaign like this, everything is very short term. So they create these alliances for the moment, really, in a hope, yes, that something will come out of it. But the alliances like that probably never work very effectively.
This huge and deep analogies with the COVID story.
Yeah.
And that probably motivated you from the first.
Yeah, exactly.
To look at this age. But are you trying to to produce a consistent, systemic comparison, resemblances, differences?
It will be
and the connected question: are there other examples among the academics, or maybe some other catastrophes? Because it's clearly connected to this catastrophic character of the event.
So it will be a chapter in a book which I'll co-write with Steve Hutchings, but there, what I would like to focus on, yes, I will draw parallels, but I don't know whether you found it sort of convincing or not. That's sort of kind of my idea that in the past, local and this lower level regional press, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of newspapers potentially, with a poor quality control, Plus, they are clearly republishing the same story. The same story circulates across the whole kind of media system in the 1980s, as it already did in the 1920s, when Walter Lippmann wrote his brilliant book on public opinion, and it's basically about how the press functions. So you have the same story spreading everywhere. And so if you don't look at the national press or national media, but even sometimes national media publishes nonsense, but not on scale. But if you start looking at the bottom level, grassroots newspapers, which in the United States, that's what the majority of people live, we then see very, very similar dynamics to what we see on social media. And that actually now is quite important finding, because we exaggerate. That would mean we exaggerate the novelty of current kind of media dynamics, and also the novelty of the current problem with people consuming poor information and people within democracies not sharing reality.
Yeah, but there is another resemblance, I think, which is also kind of which is not about the medium, but about the message, which is that this major epidemic of the moment is connected to the major political concept.
Exactly.
China
Exactly.
the world.
Exactly. So, exactly. You also have political anxiety. You have public anxiety, public fear around health, and it maps onto a geopolitical conflict.
So it is politicized.
Yeah. It is hugely politicized.
Systemically politicized.
Yeah. And also what then people pay attention to, even politicians. On the surface, they claim that we want to protect the public from poor information. If we want to protect the public from poor information, then actually intent of the messenger doesn't matter. Yeah, if the message is very problematic, intent nor here nor there. And even probably who is the messenger is also not that important. If your key is to ensure that the democratic public has good information. The democratic public is supposed to have good information, and the idea that we have to have a sort of shared reality for democracy to work, it goes back to the 19th century democratic theory, with the idea of discerning citizen who is well informed. So the whole idea is that democratic elections, they make sense if the voter is well informed. Yeah, we already have Walter Lippmann, my hero. Recommend to everyone his book, The Public Opinion, where he says that this idea of well-informed democratic citizen is nonsense. There is none. And the press, basically, American press, it is on the whole very poor quality. And he explains how it works.
But you're working with this
and there is no kind of shared reality. While giving this brilliant analysis, then what he suggests, it's again very interesting, he says, you have to appoint a committee of the likes of me, and I'll tell what should be, what is true and what is not, which obviously is,
post-censorship.
Exactly. But that didn't go anywhere. In our case, on the one hand, there is this concern that the Soviets, and that's how Catherine Bailey starts her article, which is a good article. It's factually very correct about Soviet campaign. It's a massive issue, and what they're doing, they're misinforming the public about massive issue. It's a terrible sort of moral transgression on the part of the Soviets. And how the fact that they are claiming that it's lab-based, doesn't matter which lab, but lab-based, lab-produced virus. It undermines the basically trust in scientific expertise when it's most needed, and it also kind of potentially can sidetrack the finding of a cure. So the whole issue is not even that's the Soviets, but it's the public is harmed. And again, doesn't matter deliberately, not deliberately. Then what is interesting, that her counterpart on the British side, Christopher Dobson, he was very prolific kind of Cold War, basically, warrior writer about criticizing Soviet disinformation, also Soviet foreign policy. He writes about Sunday Express article. And his only issue is not the quality of claims in the article. So he's actually quite open that it's not about informing or misinforming the public, his concern. It's about whether it was remotely possible that the Sunday Express could have been in cahoots with the KGB. That's his only interest. And then he says, thankfully, Dr. John Seal, who is the main promoter of nonsense in this article, exonerates himself and the Sunday Express from this suspicion because he blames the Russians. And that's okay. And that's, of course, you can only understand that in the geopolitical context.
There's a very small addition. Probably you know this. Well, that this conspiracy theory is still alive.
Yes, yes.
To this day, and Kanye West, who's a very popular rap singer in the US, in one of his songs, he claims that US government administers AIDS. So it's still alive.
Oh, it's absolutely alive. It's alive. Was actually had its own life in the 1990s. It's also interesting. A German kind of line of conspiracy in West Germany. As I said, Seal died in 2020. He was almost 100 and he was still at it. No? Maybe from COVID, I don't know. Maybe, that's what I thought. But he was at it, and Strecke continued, and there is a Strecke group which is still promoting online. It's also would be interesting, but I think it probably needs this kind of, in a way, a separate case study, or you can have a whole book about this thing, how it plays out in the digital age, actually even by the same actors. Yeah, and Strecke himself died in the 2010s, so also lived a long life, 2010s. And he apparently died in a car crash, and his group thinks he was killed because of his revelation about AIDS. So, but it's interesting that clearly both Strecke, Seal, and probably Segal, they are particular types. They're conspiracy theorists, and they're totally obsessed. It's already looked at the kind of descriptions of Seal's archive. It's online, but I will need to work with. He sent letters to newspapers every day.
Like Trump.
Yeah, so again, it's interesting. Letters work as social media now. He would have been on social media today, but also creating this following. But there he uses the press. Yeah.
Are there psychological or psychoanalytical studies of these people, because they are this kind of fanatics, enthusiasts, they are obsessed. You see.
Oh, there are.
The whole thing develops like a Freudian dream, like with wish fulfillment, realizing the wish. And the wish probably in this case would be the like in Seal's case, because he's like homophobic and like a communist. So his wish is to punish these homosexuals by using this most powerful weapon, which is the KGB.
Yeah.
Creating this conjecture for punishing.
There is psychoanalytical literature on conspiracy theories, but also there is a actually excellent book by American psychologist Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. I would really recommend reading it. And it's he's a psychologist, and he analyzes how basically we process information and conspiracy theories, and why people can become obsessed, and some are more susceptible to becoming obsessed than the others, is one of his kind of case studies he discussed. And I found a brilliant book, and actually it helped me reflect on my own thinking.
Are there other cases like similar, say, some other epidemics? Have they also created this kind of conspiracy?
Yeah. There is actually quite an interesting study produced by WHO where they asked me to write on AIDS. But at the time, because that's my contribution is very uninteresting, because I had no idea about what I found on newspapers.com. Because I thought I will look at AIDS, and what I was at the time, I revisit all the material which is available, and what I thought that I will kind of produce a more a kind of in-depth study of how the kind of AIDS narratives, which were problematic, worked in different linguo-cultural environments. That's what I originally thought I would do, and I produced something for WHO report on that, and then I found this database of local newspapers, totally different story emerged, but they give all sorts of examples of other epidemics with, almost every major disease, and particularly when you first don't know the origin, it's new, you don't have a cure, you have very similar dynamics, basically.
Yeah, the origins are always foreign.
Yeah, the origin will be very similar. It's like, Fraser's book, The Golden Branch, So the archetypical myths, very small number, and here it's very similar picture.
There is X-Files, the TV series, and there was a conspiracy theory about smallpox. Conspiracy theory. It was actually one of the central lines of the X-Files, and it was amplified. Fox Mulder was a great believer, the righteous mind. He was obsessed with telling the truth to people. He was not doing this out of malign intent. No, he wanted to help. He wanted to, everybody to know that the U.S. government, it was not a foreign actor. It was the U.S. government that was trying to control the population with this smallpox.
Which makes me think of what is the role of the Catholic Church in this, because the first conspiracy I could think of is the syphilis in the 16th century, when that was brought back from the Americas, and because it has all these nervous effects and people look crazy at some point before they die, a lot of people thought that it was God punishing them from invading the Americas, and so before they could understand also and address really the Venerian, and I guess it helped science actually to understand Venerian communication of diseases. But so the Catholic Church was involved.
There are a few, again, if I try to look at the kind of profiles of newspapers, local, regional, and most titles, I've never heard of this. Nobody has ever heard of this. Researchers have never heard of this newspaper. Some of them clearly are Catholic, both in the States and in Britain, but they're in a minority. So in kind of my story, the Catholic Church is not a major player. Although I think Strecker had more of a connection with the Catholics than Seal in the States. But syphilis is very important because there was this, this Tuskegee experiment, which was really, it's probably the worst kind of indeed experiment conducted in the United States. It was like over huge number of years. It started probably, I think, in the 1930s, and was only stopped in 1972 when there was experiment on Black people who had AIDS. With in order to again find the cure, see how people react to antibiotics, a certain group were not told they had AIDS and were not given antibiotics which were already available to see how the disease progressed. And it wasn't stopped until 1972, and then there was a huge scandal. That's, of course, that everyone refers to this, from the Soviets to sort of my actors, to Tony Brown, who produced this sensational PBS program. Look, the Americans can do those things. Indeed, the Americans could do those things, and I found that Thomas Reed's book particularly sort of brilliant. He shows they could. The difference with the Soviets, the CIA was up to terrible things, particularly in the 1950s, but even beyond. But the difference is that in the American context, maybe not perfectly, but the US Congress has some oversight. And so you can have a revelation, you have a scandal, practice stops. But in the authoritarian, totalitarian system, you have no oversight. And it's actually a norm.
But the Soviets actually, the Soviets and Russians nowadays, they barely treat AIDS because it's expensive to treat AIDS and it's all kind of foreign. Pharmaceuticals. So there is so much AIDS now in Russia. Basically, that means that Soviets and Russians do spread AIDS because it is spreading from the air, over the air, confirming